Fear does not appear when you are weak. It appears when your system detects uncertainty and tries to protect you from potential loss. The problem is not fear itself. It's when fear becomes the main decision maker. In that state, you don't choose based on direction, values, or logic. You choose based on avoidance, and avoidance shrinks your world one decision at a time. Right now, before important choices, your mind runs simulations, worst-case scenarios, rejection, failure, regret. The brain treats imagined outcomes as signals. Your body reacts as if the danger were already present. Heart rate shifts, muscles tighten, breathing shortens, clarity drops. You call this intuition, but often it is simply your threat system trying to eliminate uncertainty by pushing you toward the safest-looking option, not the most aligned one. If nothing changes, your life becomes a series of smaller and smaller moves. Not because you lack capacity, but because your system equates unfamiliar with unsafe. The first strategy to weaken fear before deciding is this: separate sensation from meaning. Fear produces physical sensations, tension in the chest, pressure in the stomach, quickened thoughts. But the mind immediately adds a story. This means it's wrong. This means I'll fail. This means I shouldn't do it. Sensation and interpretation fuse so quickly you assume they are the same. They are not. Your body reacts to uncertainty, not necessarily to danger. Growth, change, exposure, and meaningful risk all trigger similar physiological responses. The system flags intensity, not accuracy. When you learn to separate the physical signal from the narrative, fear loses authority. The moment you feel fear before a decision, do not argue with the thoughts. Shift attention to the raw sensation. Where is it? Chest, throat, stomach? Describe it neutrally. Tight, warm, heavy, moving. This interrupts the mental storyline and brings awareness to the body. Why does this work? Because the story amplifies the response. Sensation plus catastrophic interpretation equals escalating fear. Sensation without story equals a wave that rises and falls. Most people try to eliminate fear by reasoning with it. That rarely works when the body is activated. The nervous system responds first, logic second. You must calm the signal before evaluating the meaning. Breathing helps here, but not as a trick, as a message. Slow, steady exhalations tell the system that activation does not equal immediate threat. As the body downshifts, the mind's predictions lose urgency. Notice something important. You are not convincing yourself the fear is wrong. You are allowing the sensation to exist without giving it command. This changes the internal hierarchy. Fear becomes data, not direction. Another part of this first strategy is recognizing that intensity does not equal importance. A decision that matters often triggers fear because stakes feel higher, but the nervous system interprets important and dangerous in similar ways. If you rely on intensity as a guide, you avoid precisely the choices that could expand your life. When you observe fear instead of merging with it, you create a gap, and in that gap, choice returns. You might notice resistance to doing this. The mind wants to solve fear by escaping the situation. That brings temporary relief, which reinforces avoidance. But relief is not resolution. The system never learns that you can experience fear and remain safe. Each time you stay with the sensation without fleeing, you update the internal model. You teach the system that activation does not always require retreat, that learning weakens future fear responses. Before continuing, consider the last decision you avoided because it felt wrong. Was it actually dangerous or simply uncertain? That distinction may have changed the outcome. The second strategy addresses the cognitive side of fear. Shrink the imagined future. Fear before decisions often comes from projecting far ahead. Your mind doesn't evaluate the next step. It jumps to imagined consequences weeks, months, years ahead. The larger the mental time horizon, the greater the perceived risk. Your system reacts to these simulations as if they are unfolding now. Instead of evaluating, what if this goes badly long-term? Bring the frame back to the immediate step. Ask, what is the smallest reversible move available? This shifts the brain from catastrophic projection to problem-solving mode. Reversibility matters. When the mind believes a decision is permanent, threat perception rises. When you identify the next step as adjustable, threat drops. You are not committing to the entire path. You are committing to one action that provides information. Information reduces fear. Uncertainty without action feeds it. This approach reframes decisions from identity-defining moments to experiments. Experiments carry less emotional weight because their purpose is learning, not proving. Notice how different this feels. Instead of asking, "Is this the right choice for my future?" you ask, "Is this a useful next move, given what I know now?" One question triggers pressure. The other triggers curiosity. Curiosity and fear cannot dominate at the same time. Curiosity engages exploratory systems. Fear activates defensive systems. Shifting to experimentation changes the internal chemistry of decision-making. You may still feel fear, but its intensity drops because the perceived cost of being wrong decreases. Most paralysis comes from trying to guarantee outcomes, but guarantees are unavailable in complex decisions. When you wait for certainty, fear wins by default. Action in small, reversible steps creates feedback. Feedback replaces imagined catastrophe with real data. Real data is usually less extreme than prediction. Combine both strategies and something powerful happens. You feel fear, but you don't fuse with it. You take small steps, but you don't feel trapped. The system learns that uncertainty is survivable and that movement does not equal danger. Over time, fear still appears before meaningful decisions, but it stops dictating them. You begin choosing based on direction rather than relief. And that shift changes the scale of your life. If this perspective is altering how you see your hesitation before choices, pause and notice that awareness. Awareness is the moment you stop being run by automatic fear responses. And when fear loses its monopoly on your decisions, possibility expands. When fear stops being the commander, something subtle but profound shifts inside you. Decisions begin to feel less like threats to survive and more like movements to explore. But there is an important truth to accept here. Fear does not disappear when you become stronger. It appears whenever you approach growth, exposure, or change. The difference is not in whether fear shows up, but in whether you interpret its presence as a stop sign or as background noise. Most people have unknowingly trained their systems to treat fear as authority. The sequence is automatic. Feel fear, assume danger, avoid, feel relief. That relief is powerful reinforcement. Your nervous system learns avoidance equals safety. The pattern strengthens, and the threshold for fear lowers over time. Soon, even small uncertainties trigger the same response. That is how lives shrink gradually. The first strategy, separating sensation from meaning, interrupts this loop at the body level. The second strategy, shrinking the imagined future, interrupts it at the cognitive level. Together, they change how fear is processed, not by suppressing it, but by reducing its influence on action. There is another dimension to understand. Fear narrows perception. When activated, your mind searches for confirmation of risk. It highlights potential failure and minimizes potential growth. This is not negativity, it is survival bias. But survival bias is designed to keep you alive, not fulfilled. When you step back from fear's interpretation and limit the decision frame to the next small move, perception widens. You begin to see options instead of only threats. You might notice that once you take a small step, the fear changes quality. It becomes less sharp, more diffuse. That is because uncertainty decreases with action. The unknown becomes partially known. Even if the outcome is not perfect, the system updates its model. I acted, I survived, I learned. That update weakens future fear responses. Without action, the opposite happens. The imagined scenario remains untested, free to grow in your mind. Each day of inaction allows fear to expand without constraint. The decision becomes heavier, more charged, more difficult. Action shrinks fear. Avoidance feeds it. Another key element here is identity. Many decisions feel terrifying, not because of the practical consequences, but because of what they might mean about you. What if I fail? Often translates internally to, what if this proves I'm not capable? Fear attaches to self-image. When you approach decisions as experiments rather than verdicts, you loosen this identity pressure. An experiment can fail without defining you. It only provides information. This cognitive reframe reduces emotional stakes and allows clearer thinking. You are not trying to remove risk. You are changing how your system relates to it. There will still be discomfort. That is normal. But discomfort no longer equals danger. It becomes a sign you are at the edge of familiarity, which is often where growth lives. You might ask, but what if my fear is valid? Sometimes it is. That is why the goal is not to ignore fear, but to evaluate it after regulation, not during activation. When the body is calmer and the time frame is smaller, you can assess real risks more accurately. Fear that persists after calming the body and focusing on the next step often points to practical considerations. Fear that dissipates under these conditions was likely amplified by interpretation. Learning to tell the difference is a skill, and like any skill, it strengthens with practice. Notice how different decision-making feels when it is not driven by urgency to escape discomfort. Instead of rushing to relieve fear, you allow it to exist while you gather information. That pause restores agency. Agency is the antidote to fear-based living. Over time, as you repeatedly experience fear without retreating and take small, informed steps, your nervous system recalibrates. Situations that once triggered strong responses begin to feel manageable, not because they became safe, but because your system learned you can handle uncertainty. This is resilience built through exposure and regulation, not through force. And there is a final shift that may surprise you. As fear weakens its hold, curiosity grows. Where fear once asked, "How could this go wrong?" curiosity asks, "What might I discover?" The same situation, different internal orientation. Curiosity moves you forward. Fear freezes or retreats. The goal is not to eliminate fear before deciding. The goal is to prevent fear from being the sole input. When other signals, values, direction, information share influence, decisions become more balanced. You may still feel your heartbeat faster before a big move. That is not failure, that is activation. The difference is that now, activation does not dictate your path. You choose anyway. And each time you do, the internal map updates. Fear loses exclusivity. Choice regains ground. If this understanding changes how you relate to your hesitation, take a moment to register it. That recognition is the beginning of a new pattern, one where fear is acknowledged, regulated, and considered, but not obeyed automatically. From there, your life expands, not because fear vanished, but because you stopped letting it define the edges of your decisions. At this stage, a deeper realization starts to form. Fear is not just an emotion, it is a prediction system. It tries to anticipate loss before it happens, but predictions are built from past data, not future reality. And if your past includes moments of embarrassment, rejection, failure, or uncertainty, your system overestimates the probability of those outcomes repeating. This is not because you are pessimistic. It is because your brain is efficient. It uses stored patterns to reduce uncertainty. But efficiency can become limitation when old patterns are applied to new contexts. When fear appears before a decision, what you are often experiencing is not a clear reading of the present. It is an echo of previous discomfort projected forward. That is why separating sensation from meaning is so powerful. You stop assuming the prediction is accurate. You feel the signal, but you don't grant it automatic credibility, and shrinking the imagined future breaks the amplification loop. The brain cannot catastrophize an entire imagined future when you anchor attention to the next concrete, reversible action. Together, these strategies move you from predictive panic to adaptive response. You begin to operate from updated data instead of outdated assumptions. Another important shift occurs when you practice this repeatedly. Tolerance for uncertainty increases. Uncertainty is the raw material of fear. Most people try to eliminate uncertainty before acting, but that is impossible in meaningful decisions. The more you wait for certainty, the more stuck you become. But each time you act without full certainty and discover that you can handle the outcome, your tolerance grows. Uncertainty becomes less threatening. Fear signals still appear, but they are softer, less absolute. This is how confidence is built, not from guaranteed success, but from repeated evidence that you can navigate unknowns. Notice the difference between confidence and comfort. Comfort is the absence of challenge. Confidence is the presence of capability within challenge. Fear often signals the boundary between comfort and growth. If you always retreat at that boundary, confidence never expands. The strategies you are applying allow you to cross that boundary without overwhelming your system. There is also a physiological dimension here. When fear is constantly obeyed, the nervous system becomes more sensitive. The threshold for activation lowers. Small stressors feel large. When fear is experienced but not followed by avoidance, the system recalibrates. It learns that activation does not require retreat. The threshold rises. Resilience grows. You are not just changing thoughts, you are retraining neural responses. This is why progress may feel subtle at first. The change is happening at the level of patterns, not dramatic breakthroughs. One decision handled differently. One moment of fear observed instead of obeyed. One small action taken despite discomfort. These are not small in effect, they accumulate. Over time, you may notice that decisions that once felt paralyzing now feel like manageable steps. Not easy, but navigable. The intensity of fear no longer matches the scale of the situation. That is recalibration. You might still hear the voice of fear saying, "What if this goes wrong?" But now another voice appears. "What if it goes right? What will I learn either way?" That second voice is not forced optimism. It is perspective restored. Fear narrows perspective. Regulation widens it. And with wider perspective, decisions become less about escaping discomfort and more about aligning with direction. You begin asking, which choice moves me closer to the life I want to experience, instead of which choice feels safest right now? The safest option in the short term is often the most limiting in the long term. But when fear is weakened, you can see beyond immediate relief. There is a quiet strength in making decisions with fear present, but not in control. It builds self-trust. You learn that you can rely on yourself, not because you avoid difficulty, but because you move through it. Self-trust is what ultimately reduces fear's power. When you trust your ability to respond, uncertainty loses some of its threat. You stop needing guarantees. And once you stop needing guarantees, options open. Life expands not because risk disappears, but because you are no longer confined to what feels immediately safe. This is the transformation happening beneath the surface, from fear as authority to fear as information, from avoidance as protection to action as learning, from paralysis to movement. Every meaningful path includes moments of fear. The goal is not to reach a point where decisions feel completely calm. The goal is to reach a point where fear does not dictate the edges of your world. That point is built through practice, through feeling, observing, reframing, and stepping forward anyway. And each time you do, the internal map updates again. I can experience fear and still choose. That is freedom not from fear, but from fear's control. And once that freedom begins to grow, another layer becomes visible. Fear was never only about the decision in front of you. It was about the illusion that your future depends on getting this one moment exactly right. That illusion creates enormous internal pressure. Every choice feels like a final exam. Every path seems irreversible. Under that weight, fear intensifies, because the mind believes the cost of error is permanent damage to your life story. But reality is far more dynamic. Most decisions do not determine your destiny in isolation. They interact with countless other variables: timing, environment, learning, adaptation. Your life is not a straight line built from perfect choices. It is a network of adjustments, corrections, and evolving direction. Fear loses intensity when you understand that a decision is rarely the end of the road. It is a data point along the way. This is why shrinking the imagined future is so powerful. You stop projecting the entire weight of your future onto a single step. You return to the real scale of the moment, a step, not a sentence. The nervous system can handle steps. It struggles with imagined lifetimes. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism here. Fear before decisions often arises from a desire to protect your identity, how you see yourself, how others see you. What if this choice makes me look foolish? What if I'm exposed as not good enough? These concerns are about image, not survival. When you observe fear at the level of sensation and approach decisions as experiments, identity becomes less fragile. You are no longer trying to prove who you are with every action. You are learning who you are through action. Learning tolerates uncertainty. Proving does not. When proving dominates, fear spikes. When learning dominates, curiosity grows. Curiosity is not the absence of fear. It is a different orientation toward the unknown. It asks, what can this teach me, instead of, how can this hurt me? That shift changes internal chemistry, less stress response, more exploratory activation. And here is something subtle but important. When you repeatedly choose based on direction instead of fear relief, your sense of personal coherence strengthens. You begin to feel aligned with yourself. That alignment generates a form of stability that reduces future fear. In other words, acting in alignment builds the very confidence that makes future decisions less frightening. Avoidance, on the other hand, erodes alignment. Each avoided decision leaves a trace of self-doubt. I didn't act when it mattered. That doubt feeds future fear. The loop tightens. So every time you apply these strategies, you are not just handling a single decision differently. You are altering the trajectory of how you relate to yourself. Self-trust grows when you see yourself face discomfort and move anyway. And self-trust is one of the strongest buffers against fear. You begin to realize that even if things don't go as planned, you can adapt. Adaptability is more valuable than certainty. Certainty is static. Adaptability is dynamic. Fear wants guarantees. Growth requires adaptability. This does not mean ignoring risk. It means evaluating risk with a regulated system and a realistic time frame. Some decisions do carry significant consequences, but even then, panic is not helpful. Clarity emerges from calm analysis, not from fear-driven urgency. When the body is calmer and the imagined future is smaller, you can ask better questions. What do I value here? What information do I actually have? What is the next useful step? These questions guide decisions from a place of agency rather than reactivity. Over time, you may notice that fear becomes less dramatic, more like a background signal. It still appears at edges of growth, but it no longer feels like an alarm demanding retreat. It feels like activation before movement, similar to the feeling before stepping onto a stage or starting something meaningful. That activation can even become energizing instead of paralyzing. You start recognizing fear not as a wall, but as a doorway. Not every doorway must be entered, but you are no longer afraid of approaching them. And perhaps the most important shift of all, you stop waiting to feel ready. Readiness is often a myth created by fear to delay action. You act when direction is clear enough, not when fear disappears. That is how lives expand. Not through the absence of fear, but through decisions made with fear present, yet not in control. Every time you practice this, you redraw the boundary of your comfort zone. It stretches. What once felt overwhelming becomes normal. What once felt impossible becomes possible. And slowly, almost without noticing, you look back and realize the decisions you once avoided are now simply part of your lived experience. That is the long-term effect of weakening fear before deciding, not dramatic bravery, but steady expansion. You don't become fearless. You become free to move with fear as a companion, not a ruler. And from that place, your choices begin to reflect who you want to become, not what you are trying to escape.